Uh, Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Delighted to have Aiden back on this Practical Jung series. And today he has a special guest, David Bloome, and he's going to be talking about Marie-Louise von Franz. So take it away, Aiden.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for coming. And I'm delighted to have with us today David Bloome, a friend of mine who has been bitten by the Marie-Louise von Franz bug and has a long-standing relationship with her books, her ideas. And I've learned a lot from David on this topic, and I'm excited to learn more and be able to introduce this topic to all of you. So David, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. So I want to give a few more thank yous out. I want to formally thank Aiden for putting together Practical Jung. A few months ago, I just decided, hey, I want to start reaching out and talking about Jung to people. And I looked up at the LA meetup groups and I saw Aiden. I went to his website. I see he's a professional coach and he's a very intriguing person. I think that Aiden, a couple of years from now, is going to be an international superstar. He's sort of like a modern day Merlin. He knows how to take Jungian concepts and really apply them in practical ways. So I would urge everyone to check out his website, become a client now, because Aiden's not going to have a lot of time for you in a couple of years between book signings. So I just very impressed with what you're doing.
Thank you, David.
And, Shrikant, this format really works for me. I love your enthusiasm, your energy, how you do this. It just fulfilled all my dreams of what I wanted in this kind of community. So I'm very impressed. I've been to many different Zoom and online types of groups and you run it so well. So thank you for the work you do.
Thank you, David.
And I just want to thank everyone for being here today and your interest in this topic. I know there's an interesting mix where people have a lot of expertise with Carl Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz. And I know there's a lot of people who may not even be familiar with their ideas. So I'm going to try and find sort of a happy medium in my talk. So I apologize to the experts and I apologize to people who are going, you didn't really explain it very well, but let's go on a journey. So I'm going to show you my high-tech slides. I'm going to hit share screen. Can you guys see this okay?
Yes.
You can see my screen. Okay. So why am I calling this a treasure chest? So for 29 years, I've been studying Marie-Louise von Franz. And as I was putting together this talk, I thought, I want to pick out some of the jewels, some of the diamonds, some of the best parts of her writings and share it with you. And I was very influenced by Joseph Campbell, who told us about the hero's journey. And I do see my life as a hero's journey. And I'd like to challenge everyone today in our audience to just imagine, if you don't already, imagine yourself that you are a hero on a journey. And during this talk, what Joseph Campbell suggests is, if you go through the underworld, if you go through the trials and the ordeals, you may discover some great knowledge, some great treasure. And it's your duty to bring it back to the greater community, to bring it back to other heroes and share. So that's what I'm going to do today. My journey started in a very dark forest. The year was 1992. I was 29 years old. And I was in a very bad place. You could call it a dark forest, you could call it the desert, you could call it the wilderness, the underworld, hell. wherever it was, that's where I was. A lot of personal and professional things in my life completely fell apart, and I was lost and very unhappy. And I would go to my cousin Jeff, who I think is here today. I would hang out in his cozy little apartment at the time in Santa Monica. We called it the Burrow because it was very cozy. He had candles, classical music, great book collection. And when I did manage to get out of the fetal position on his couch, I would walk over to his bookshelves. And I noticed one time this book called Puer Arternus by Marie-Louise von Franz. I had no idea what Puer Arternus meant. I didn't know who Marie-Louise von Franz was. There was this strange looking man staring at me. So I decided, what is this? So I turned the book around, and the cover and the back, it said, what is popularly called the Peter Pan syndrome, Puer Arternus, eternal child, is von Franz's classic study of the youth within us, resistant to commitment in work or relationships, and unable to completely abandon the dreams and fantasies of adolescence. This childish innocence can thwart our self-actualization and doom us to adolescent delusions and provisional living. So I'm reading this going, you might be really describing me right now. And so when I opened the book, this was the equivalent in the movie The Matrix, where the guy Morpheus asked the hero, are you ready to take the red pill? If you swallow the red pill, you're going to go down the rabbit hole. You're going to learn about what's behind reality, and you might not like it or you might like it. Are you prepared to do this? And when I started reading Puer Arternus by Marie-Louise von Franz, that was the equivalent in my life of taking the red pill. And she started to describe the characteristics of a puer, a constant inner refusal to commit oneself to the moment. One has no need to adapt, for that would be impossible for such a hidden genius. An arrogant attitude arises towards other people due to both an inferiority complex and false feelings of superiority. A secret thought that one day one will be able to save the world. I'm like, I get it. I'm a puer. I get it. And this is where I was first introduced to Carl Jung. I have, of course, heard of Carl Jung before, but I never really studied him or his work. And it's really through the lens of von Franz that I learned about Jung, and she would quote him throughout her work. And he said about the puer, I consider the puer arternus attitude an unavoidable evil. It always leads to external blows of fate, which show the need for a new attitude. So I took from this, looking back at this years later, I felt a little better because Jung was saying, yeah, basically we're all puers one way or another, and it's unavoidable. So I felt a little better about that. I'm not alone. But then Jung said, well, be prepared to get a lot of external blows of fate. Be prepared for a lot of pain and a lot of suffering, because the puer attitude is not going to serve you well. And then von Franz said, okay, in order to get into the deeper background of the whole problem, I want to first interpret the Little Prince. And I'm like, the Little Prince? I love the Little Prince. Like, I didn't notice on the book cover in the back, they mentioned Little Prince. So this came completely out of left field. What does the Little Prince have to do with all of this? And the Little Prince was written by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And just to give you very brief background, he was French. He was a pilot who flew airmail routes in Europe, Africa, and South America. In 1935, He and his mechanic crashed in the Libyan desert, and they barely survived. That experience had a great influence on him as he created The Little Prince, which he wrote in 1942 in New York. In 1944, during World War II, when he was 44 years old, he disappeared on a reconnaissance mission over the Mediterranean. It was international news. He was extremely popular at that time. And The Little Prince has sold an estimated 140 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling and most translated books ever published. So I'm really curious right now, what is Marie-Louise von Franz going to do with The Little Prince? And the first thing she said was she started talking about the author. And this is where I started a massive transformation of how I thought about the world, because she was looking at the words and the illustrations in this book, and she was working backwards to create a picture of the personality of the author. I mean, for me at the time, it was remarkable. And she started with, well, we see he has never gotten into the world of the adult. He speaks about its emptiness, its idiocy, and its meaninglessness. He omits other aspects of adult life. He believes that his childhood life is the true life, and all the rest is empty persona running after money, making a prestige impression on other people, having lost one's true nature. This is how he sees adult life. And then page after page in this book, Marie-Louise von Franz takes apart the author's personality. I have never experienced anything like that. This is the first time I saw words like archetype, ego attitude, the self, infantile shadow, mother complex. This was a whole different language to me. I'm like, this is like the matrix codes. Like, how is this woman thinking? How does she see this just by looking at words and characters? And every page of every book she's written looks like this. I'm pointing, I'm circling. I could not believe it. And she goes on. And I remember, oh yeah, he had a girlfriend who was a rose. That's so cute. And then she proceeds to say, he gives away the fact that he was not up to the vanity and moods as well as the charm and beauty of the rose. The moodiness and all the difficulties with the haughty princess in this rose drove him off the planet. The rose is a bit sad when he leaves. An absolutely perfect description of a lover's relationship where each tortures the other. Both suffer in their inner hearts and are too proud to make a gesture of conciliation, or don't know how to negatively. Animus and Anima are opposed to each other. I'm like, what is an animus and Anima? Who is this person? Who is Marie-Louise von Franz? The very basics of her life is, in 1915, she was born in Munich. In 1919, she moved to Switzerland. And from 1928 on, she lived in Zurich. So here she is, here's Lake Zurich. This is a fairy tale setting. This is a mythic story that she is living in the middle of. And along the shores of Lake Zurich, this house looks like it's out of a complete fairy tale. Lake Zurich is right behind it. And this house belongs to the world famous Carl Jung. And what Carl Jung did was, also along the shores of Lake Zurich, he built his own retreat, the Bollingen Tower. No electricity, no power. He would go here almost like this wizard, this hermit, to sort of bond with nature and his inner world. And in 1933, when Marie-Louise von Franz was only 18 years old, she first met Carl Jung. This isn't a photo of when they first met, but she was 18 and he was 58 years old which I'll be in a couple of months. And so thus began one of the most amazing relationships, I think, in history. 1933, when they first met, what was happening? Just a couple of hours drive away, Hitler became the chancellor of Nazi Germany. And right across the ocean, FDR was inaugurated as president. There were great forces building in 1933. And I believe people will look back in history and see this relationship is just as momentous. And so over the decades, they formed an amazing partnership. And clearly, when you learn about her, you will understand how she is by far his greatest disciple. And I would have loved to have been there to hear how these two communicated with each other, because I bet Jung absolutely adored her, absolutely adored that there was someone out there that understood him, that got him, and that he could speak freely and they could work on this together. And I really imagine this relationship as if he's some sort of Merlin, Gandalf, Obi-Wan Kenobi figure offering her the secrets of the universe. And she's this young heroine observing this. And at first I'm like, well, I don't know if I like this picture with the sword because that's violent. But I remember in mythological terms, the sword is the instrument of discernment. The sword cuts through a lot of the confusion and gets right to the heart of a matter. And if there's anyone who had a genius to do that, it was Marie-Louise von Franz. She took all this information that Jung must have downloaded her, and she turned around and created an amazing bibliography of work. And when you read her, it is so smooth, it is so easy to understand that you start to forget that she's explaining some of the deepest, most esoteric concepts about psychology. And this year, synchronistically, her collective works have appeared. So hopefully it's very easy for you to collect her writing. Now, it's through Marie-Louise von Franz where I started reading Carl Jung. And between both of them, it's not like they wrote a couple of things and scholars have had to, over the years, trying to decipher them. No, between the two, over the years, there is a lot of information. But I do have to say that after you read von Franz, she's the equivalent of driving in a Tesla on a smooth paved highway. She's so easy to understand. But when I switched over to Carl Jung, it's sort of like being in a Land Rover with bad suspension and bad steering. It's a bumpy ride. I mean, his work is full of amazing insights, but it's a much harder read compared to von Franz. And given a choice of the two, I'll go with Maria. Now, I do forgive Carl a little for that bumpy ride because I watched his 3-hour, very rare interview he did in 1957. And at the time, he's 82 years old. English, of course, is not his first language. And for 3 hours, he took the most basic questions and fluidly explained his concepts. It was a remarkable performance. And at the very end of the interview, of this 3 hours, the interviewer asked him yet another simple question. And he sort of just cracks up at this point because he's like, how do I even begin to explain the complexity of that concept? I wrote so many books about that. And he sort of looks at the audience and he says, people have to read the books in spite of the fact they are thick. I'm sorry. And the way he said it, I'm not sure if he's saying people have to read the books in spite the people are thick and they don't understand, or the books themselves are thick. And when he's saying, I'm sorry, he's like, I'm sorry I've written so much, or I'm sorry you have to do the work. But whatever it was, that twinkle in his eye and the way he chuckled and looked at you when he said that, I'm like, this is one of the most magnetic personalities I've ever seen in my life. It's fantastic. Please see that interview. So what I want to do right now is I want to take some of these basic concepts that Jung and von Franz were talking about, and through von Franz's work, sort of explain what they mean. Again, my apologies to some of the more experts of you, but I'm trying to use the von Franzian lens to explain what this means. And so basically, in our psyches, in our consciousness, there's different energy centers. So for example, we consciously create our own egos, our I, who we are. I'm David Bloome. I'm a loving person. I like to have fun. I'm not perfect. These are like how I think of myself, how I think of my ego. And then my persona is sort of an extension of that. Oh, my persona right now is I'm sort of a von Franz expert. So that's my persona right now. Now, a couple of hours from now, when my wife says, well, it's time to take out the trash, I'll say, well, a von Franz expert doesn't have to take out the trash. And then I become a persona non grata. Just how to put that in there. I've been well behaved. And then there's the idea of the self. And the self is sort of in this shadow world. The self is sort of in our unconscious, but the self is really the true center of our personality, the true sense of the true essence of our being. It's creating dreams, it's creating visions, it's trying to give us direction. One of the ways if I think of the power of the self is consciously, I can remember 10 items on my shopping list. My self energy is managing 30 trillion cells at the same time in my body, how I breathe, my body temperature. It is so many orders of magnitude in terms of consciousness and intelligence greater than anything I can think of. This is really my central source. And then as part of the self, there is a Anima and Animus energy. And what that means, Anima means soul, Animus means spirit. Anima energy is related to feelings and relatedness and things that we might say are feminine characteristics. And the Animus is reasoning and logos, what we call masculine characteristics. But feminine and masculine, they might be outdated terms, because whether you're a man or a woman or however you identify, you have a mix of anima and animus energy. And another central concept that's very important is the idea of individuation. And according to von Franz, individuation is the term with which C.J. Jung describes the psychological processes of inner growth and centralization by which the individual finds its own self. And how I interpret that is that we have a conscious ego, our I, but we need to unify with our unconscious self. So the idea, what von Franz is saying is we need to individually unify with our center. And this gives insight into how she is describing psychotherapy itself. She gave me a great insight of what they were trying to do. It is true that when an analyst has to sit in his office and listen to all day is not purely edifying. One has to hear stories about marital strife, mad jealousies, outbreaks of repressed resentment, sexual fantasies, many needs, and endless, than he said, than I said. It is horrible shit that the parents and all of us are struck in. But when you take a closer look, one can see the hand of God in it. That was perhaps the greatest art of Jung himself. He could listen to such garbage and remain unmoved, and then with a word or a gesture, suddenly point out the hand of God that became visible in it. So what she's saying is, let's say I was an analysis with Jung and von Franz, and I was rambling on about something, but then I might mention, and then I got in an argument with my mother, and she said, you're always so stubborn about this, you always have. And they're thinking to themselves, well, he has a very rigid ego here. And then I'm rambling on more, and I might say something, hey, and I had this dream where in the center of my room, there was this giant gold statue of myself, and it seemed to be speaking to me. And they would think, okay, now he's identifying the self. And they're like, well, tell us more about that. And I might say, well, I don't want to talk about that. You know, one time I had this fantasy where I wanted to paint myself completely purple. And then von Franz and Jung would say, okay, this guy's crazy. But anyway, they were looking for any manifestations in what I was saying to help me identify these psychic energy centers. And where it gets very interesting with von Franz is how she uses fairy tales. Because the fairy tales for her, there's actual characters that are representing the ego and the self and anima and animus. And through these stories, she's pointing out how the individuation process is taking place. And so what she says about fairy tales are the purest and simplest expression of collective unconscious psychic processes. The archetypal images afford us the best clues to understanding the processes going on in the collective psyche. So what she's seeing is this process of individuation is actually telling an exterior story. And fairy tales are honored by different communities over many generations. So they're unconsciously honoring stories that's really telling the story of individuation. So I want to just go over one very famous fairy tale to sort of amplify what I'm talking about. And this is the story of the Holy Grail. And Jung's wife, Emma Jung, started the Grail Legend, this book. She passed away and von Franz finished it for her. But what they said about the Grail is the Grail's many wonderful attributes which qualify it as a treasure hard to attain, and its analogy to the alchemical stone justify its being taken a symbol of the self. It longs for completion like an invisible form which calls out for substance. The individual is conscious of the existence of this summons and of the growth of this attraction, but without knowing what it is that called to him. The influence emanating from the hidden Grail could be likened to such a substance. So what she's saying is the Grail is the self. The Grail is calling out to the hero. And here's the hero of the Grail story, Parzival. So how does the hero fit in, and what is the mission of the hero? And to that, von Franz says, the hero is an archetypal figure which presents a model of an ego functioning in accord with the self. The ideal situation is when the ego, with a certain plasticity, obeys the central regulation of the psyche. So again, putting it in this framework, the Grail, the self, is calling out, and the ego is the hero of the story. And somehow the ego has to figure out how to find and align the self. And then there's two other players in the story, the Anima and the Animus. So what does von Franz have to say about that? before I get to that, I do want to mention something about the hero. So we notice Parsifal, the hero, in this story, he's a white European male. So the question is, if he was a different race or different ethnicity or from a different geography, would it be the same story? Would it be the same dynamic? And some scholars have argued, yes, it would be the same dynamic because these stories are universal. But then you can say, well, were those scholars white European males? I think it would be a fascinating discussion to have. Does this story hold up in today's world? Or what are the differences? Or what happens if Parsifal was a woman? Would it be the same process as well? And here's where von Franz is absolutely fascinating, because she wrote a book called Feminine and Fairy Tales. And being a man and her being a woman, her insight into female psychology and this journey was absolutely riveting. So I would highly recommend looking at Feminine and the Fairy Tale. And then this idea of forget man and woman, because we have a mix of these energies. How does it just all play out in general? And then I just want to mention the horse might say, well, the horse has a say in the story. I don't want you to ride me anymore with all your heavy armor. You're on your own yourself, and animals have their own journey. But anyway, the point is, like, we should all revisit what we mean in today's world by the hero's journey and how the hero's journey could be different for different people. So I'd like to go to the Anima and Animus, which to me are two of the most intriguing characters in the story. And this is what von Franz has to say. The Anima and the Animus are super personal to great extent. They belong to the divine realm. Now just think about what she's saying, my fellow heroes. She's saying these are independent, autonomous beings in our psyche. Whether we know it or not, whether we recognize it or not, there are independent energies working in our psyche. It sort of blew me away. And so when we go back to the Parsifal story, Parsifal is surrounded by the Animus guy. This is Gerinmans, and he has masculine features. He's looking up to the stars in the heaven. He is Logos. And then there's Kundry, and she is the Anima guide. And she's trying to literally, in this painting, keep his feet on the earth. And so these two guides have appeared on the hero's journey to find that inner self. And what's really, really fascinating is when you think about Jung's Red Book, what did he mention? Two guides appeared, the Animus guide, Elijah, and the Anima guide, Salome. It's the same story. It's remarkable. And I know that the Holy Grail myth had a huge influence on Jung and von Franz. But what they're saying is when you have that shattering experience, when you're going to the depths of the psyche, the Anima and the Animus guides will appear. And they appear in story after story, fairy tale, myths, religion. It's pretty amazing to see how this affected Carl Jung and how it manifested in his own personal story. So now you see with the Holy Grail story, the Holy Grail in the center of the self, Parsifal, the hero ego. And then you saw a couple of examples of the Anima and Animus guides. And when you put it all together, you get this sort of divine connection with all the players. Here's the hero ego in alignment and harmony with the Grail, surrounded by the Animus and the Anima soul guides. This is the goal of the hero's journey. So I want to start wrapping up by returning to Puer Arternus. And this is where I'm very grateful for being asked to give this talk, because it made me really think about what they mean by childhood, what they mean by adulthood in a psychological sense. Because we can think we're an adult. Hey, I have kids, I have a job, or I have grandkids, or I've done a successful business. You know, I'm considered an adult by my culture. But could there be a possibility that unless you go on that inner journey that von Franz was describing, are you really just a child your whole life? Could you expend your whole existence being psychologically a child? And sort of look at where our culture is right now. Could we just have a completely puer culture? Look at what we look at. Superhero movies, look at what some of our politicians or advertisements say. Like, I look at it now as, these are puers. Are we a puer culture? And what's it going to take for us to go on that journey of connection? And Jung reminds us, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. What he's saying is, a lot of people just don't want to go there. I'm too busy. It sounds weird. I don't want to go on that journey. But let's remember what Jung literally put. He literally carved this above the doorway of his house. He wrote, called or not, the God will be there. And what I interpret that out is, whether we like it or not, there is a divine psychological energy within us. And if you're going to pass through this doorway, his job, von Franz's job, is to help connect you with that. That God, those energies are there. And what he was saying, as I remind you, is the puer aeternus attitude is an unavoidable evil. So most of us are on that track, but we will get blows of fate until we get a new attitude. And von Franz had a quote. She said, nature grinds you to your essence. And what they're saying there is, if you avoid that God within, or the self, if you don't take that inner journey, you're going to suffer a lot. You're going to have a lot of pain and turmoil, because that inner world wants to be known. And so what is the cure to the problem of the puer aeternus? And von Franz said, Dr. Jung spoke of one cure: work. Work is the one disagreeable word which no puer aeternus likes to hear. And Dr. Jung came to the conclusion that it was the right answer. My experience also has been that it is through work that a man can pull out of this youthful neurosis. If you do the work to understand how you create your ego, to understand the workings of the inner self, to understand and relate and connect with the anima and animus, then you don't have to be trapped in a dark forest. If you do the work, you can find an alignment with the divine. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Aiden?
Yeah, amazing. I don't know where to start. I mean, what an incredible presentation. I have so many thoughts, and I'll be excited to hear other people's reactions and the breakout rooms and takeaways. I had the pleasure of being able to experience this presentation twice, because David and I kind of played, he gave me a working model, and then I got to see it again. So what's cool is different things jumped out for me this time versus the first time, David, which was very cool to see. And, I don't even know where to start other than to say that was awesome. And what do you think? What's the next sort of step in terms of, David, what would you like next coming out of the presentation?
We have two options. Let me give you two options in terms of format. One option, which I recommend at this point, is to let people go and discuss this amongst themselves, bring up whatever questions, observations in the breakout rooms, and then come back and ask questions to David, because then that allows them to kind of air out all their questions, refocus on the best things that they have, and then come back with that. That's what I would recommend. David, what do you think?
Everything works for me. So
all right. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Is that okay, Aiden?
Love it.
All right, folks. So I'm going to, give me just a second. I'm going to post the rules for the breakout rooms in the chat. So folks, let everybody talk for about 1 to 2 minutes on their observations, both their takeaways and questions, and then have a general discussion. After which, we'll come back automatically to this room, and there you'll be able to share your takeaways. What did you get from the presentation and your breakout room discussion, and ask any questions that you have to David. All right, I'm starting the breakout rooms now. For takeaways.
I might jump in, Shrikant,
Yes,
if that's
please.
okay. Just
Go ahead.
get a couple of thoughts that kind of almost piggyback on the presentation.
Go ahead.
Where's David? Oh, there he is. I was just looking for him specifically. Such a great topic, and our group was incredible. I'm excited to hear what everyone else took away in their questions. I almost want to piggyback on a couple of things and throw a couple of things onto the table, just in case this adds to the questions or the feedback or the takeaways. Let's see. I'm just going to rattle them off. There's not that many. I love that you mentioned this, David, the 140 million copies of Little Prince. I didn't realize that fact, but it's so interesting because it means that it resonates with people, right? So just like Freud, for example, when Freud came out with such a psychosexual theory, it resonated with people because that was simmering under the surface. So I love this presentation in the sense that it must collectively be kind of simmering under the surface. And why else would 140 million copies get sold, right? So the pu'er problem is a real problem. And that fact kind of blew my mind. Let's see where to even start. So one thing I want to say is that, I guess the main thing I want to say is that Jung points out this idea that there's two kinds of adaptation. There's two kinds of adaptation. So when we develop two kinds of adaptation to the outer world, and adaptation to the inner world. And I want to make that distinction because when we talk about the work, quote unquote, we can ask the question, on what level are we talking about? I think the puer aeternus definition of being unable to commit to relationship or to work is largely an outer world problem. A puer that cannot commit to a long-standing relationship or a long-standing type of work where they come into the present moment and they can do the work and they can do their job and this kind of thing is really an outer adaptation problem. However, of course, inner life and outer life are related, so it's actually kind of a complicated point. I just want to make the case that Jung's idea of the answer to puer aeternus being the work, I want to add to what you're saying, David, which is to say sometimes it's an outer work, getting a job, doing something that makes money, consistently sticking to it. I often find the way forwards for people is the way that's lesser developed. So why do I want to say that? I have a lot of notes and I'm just kind of looking through them. I think that Jung would, Jung quotes somebody else, I forget who he quotes, and says that fate guides the willing and drags the unwilling. So fate guides the willing and drags the unwilling. So ultimately, when we have this thing that nature will grind us to our essence, for some of us, if we're too outer focused, the persona side of your graph, David, if our thing is about work and making an impression and identifying with our work, fate's going to hit us from the inside. Like the work is the inner work, right? How do I'm so identified with my job, the stuff that I'm doing out in the world. The way forward is to get in touch with myself on my inner landscape. Okay. But vice versa, if I'm a person who's really absorbed in my inner landscape and I don't have a lot of control over the impression that I'm making on others, committing to relationships, committing to work, well, that person the necessitation for them would be to adapt outwardly. So for the first category, adaptation to the inner world is called for. And for the second person, adaptation to the outer world is called for. So the work kind of is operating on these two levels. I wanted to point that out. And last thing I want to point out is something you said, David, the hand of God. Gosh, I love that. And I want to say about that, when we find the hand of God in these stories, it's kind of saying, so really quickly, the modern psychiatric model kind of looks at symptoms and let's do away with them. Something's uncomfortable, let's do away with that thing that is uncomfortable. The soul level, the soul approach to symptomology, whether it's psychological or physical at times, you would say, what's the energy underneath this symptom trying to bring to my attention? What's it trying to bring to my attention that I can, you touched on this, David, but that I can transmute into something meaningful, or that is not just a problem, but generates a new path forwards. Psychiatry often does not have that. The biomedical model is to do away with the symptom. The Jungian model is to say, what's on the other side of that symptom? It's where the gold is. Like your dark forest experience, David, to bring it back to this, it's sort of like you had this dark moment and then found that book and look where it took you. Incredible. So anyways, I could say so many more things. I'm just such a joy for me to sort of host another expert on the topic and just listen. I really enjoyed that. And I'm looking forward to hearing everybody else's feedback. So
wonderful. David, would you like to comment on any of that?
Yeah, so, yeah, being Aiden, he brings up such great insights. I think we are in a poor culture. I mean, superheroes flying through the air, people just promising us materialistic. I mean, look at what we're surrounded by. It's a poor culture. It's not like in the middle of a news break going, okay, let's have a moment and talk about the self and the hero's journey. Like, it's just non-existent. And I think that the challenge is, you said something and it really triggered with me. It's like, if people don't know this inner world exists, then they're going to really be searching in the outer world for nothing. They're never going to find it. And then they're never going to commit to anything, because I think psychologically that non-commitment in the outer world is this isn't doing it for me. This isn't fulfilled. So they just hop from one thing to another because there's an utter lack of knowledge of the journey within and what that could yield for you. And so I think that's what's creating a consumption-based materialist culture. We're just on this giant search for it. And just to wrap up, it inside, like that doorway of Jung's house, it does not like to be ignored. So it's going to emanate an energy that's very disturbing. So you have two things happening. In the inner world, you have a very unhappy self in Anima and Animus. And in the outer world, you're going, wow, I'm really working and spinning my wheels and I'm not happy. And then when you put it in perspective, you're like, wow, I sort of understand where we are in our cultural story right now. So that's my reaction to what you said.
Thank you, David. Next up is going to be Nicholas. So folks, just you can line up for asking questions or talking about your takeaways by typing an exclamation mark in the chat, or you can raise your hand in Zoom. Nicholas, go ahead.
Okay. Firstly, I just want to say thank you, David. This was wonderful. I have a question, and it's going to require some speculation, but I'll ask anyways. So what I'm wondering is, do you think that Jung and von Franz would say that man's experience of woman, or conversely, woman's experience of man, the idea of a soulmate, or love at first sight, and all of those things. Would they say that this this transpersonal concept of the anima and animus is at the core of that experience? And also, does that, since I've heard it described as a capacity for relatedness, does that pull us into relatedness?
I think that's the money question, Nicholas. I was saying in my group, the concepts of anima and animus is the most intriguing things to me in psychology. I am so intrigued by, within all of us, we have, you can call it a masculine, feminine energy, soul or spirit energy. And that's just the relationship inside yourself. And then when you bring in a partner or someone else, those energies are all communicating with each other. Like, it has nothing to do with what you think's going on. Like, those energies are communicating. It's fascinating. And a book I recommend by John Sanford, it's called Invisible Partners. Of all the books I read about von Franz and Jung, this book was sort of like a self-help book using anima and animus concepts just to have a good relationship. So it's something I could talk on forever. So you're touching on something that's extremely fascinating and valuable to research.
Thank you, David. Next up is going to be Elle. Elle, go ahead.
Well, thank you. David, I had a takeaway, but I would ask the question, do you believe that for us to develop ourselves, for self-development, would it be good for us to undertake to know this material better, or to even go through some type of analysis, so that we may develop this? And could we get away from the puella, if you will, the superficiality and the wanting everything immediately? And this seems to be inherent in our culture, and also with technology. Everything has to be done so quickly. And to problem solve, is it possible to do that? It seems that to problem solve for the immediacy, we have to undertake these quicker methods. And what would your comment be on that, please? And thank you.
I love Perella. That's fantastic. It's a great character name. I can only speak for myself that I think, look, none of us are islands. So we need to surround ourselves by friends, mentors, family members, and we need to all sort of exchange notes, how to get through the hero's journey that is life. And so I think our individual responsibility is gravitating, whether it's towards a Jung or a von Franz or going to an analyst. Like, it's very hard because the culture bombards us with images round the clock of the materialism. It's a puer culture, right? So you're being bombarded by, so our assumption is the puer lifestyle is the right lifestyle. So it's very hard to sort of detach from all that stimuli and go, I have to consciously maybe pick up a book on von Franz, or maybe participate in this kind of group. If you don't, I think you're just going to be swept in this tsunami, like you described, this instant and with technology, it's a tsunami of puerdom right now. So it's really going to take effort to sort of find, a life raft or a little island to sit on and go, look, how do I move away from this? So it's going to take a lot of effort, but there's a lot of resources that can help you do that.
Thank you, David. Next up is going to be Tanya, Muriel, and Mike. Tanya.
Hi. Okay, so I just had a few comments and a few thoughts.
Just try to be brief.
What interests me the most of Carl Jung's work triggers a desire to understand generational shifting and how individuals are innate able to adapt. I am more interested in how that shift changes within our individual consciousness and how a few of the concepts of Jung can help with understanding how we have the power over the collective unconscious. So those are just a few thoughts.
David, any thoughts?
Tanya was in our group. I mean, she
Oh.
had some great insights. And I think our culture is going through, I think our culture on one level is in sort of a dark forest. You know, that dark forest slide, I really think we're in a dark forest. And it's sort of a dangerous place because, and Tanya just triggered this with me, there's no guarantee we'll get out of the dark forest. I mean, think of how many people we know in our lives, you know, they become tragic alcoholics or they're very angry and they never pull out of it. And then there's a small percentage going, okay, I'm going to get some help or therapy, but they don't do the work and they never pull out of it. And it's very rare people that complete the journey and get out of it. And you could say that same thing with cultures. You could look back at the Roman Empire. There is a lot of cultures that just never make it. And so there's no guarantee like American culture or whatever, you know, you're looking at right now. Well, no, and that's a very humbling, scary thought. We can make it if we do the work, but we have to start telling a different story because I just think we're a poor culture right now. I think there's rumblings of something's wrong, but it's like, you know, that angry person, you're going, well, I need to change. And then they don't change. So at least they realize maybe I do need to change, but our culture isn't going, okay, let's sit down and discuss. You know, we're not there. We're sort of going, yeah, there's something wrong. So Tanya, you know, brought that up when she talks about the cultural shifts.
David, I had a quick follow-up. When do you think our culture became a poor culture? What do you think is the history when you look back at history? When, you know, around when, and what's the time frame for it? I can see very clearly that we are a poor culture. Okay. I'm just trying to trace back.
You know, and this is gonna, I don't know what I sound like here, but you could say the history of humanity has sort of been a poor culture. And that's why I made that outstanding comment, like in the year 1933 of Jung and von Franz connecting. It was like these two guides, you can almost see them as the Animus and Anima, starting to put together the story of how you move out of a poor culture. So just for fun, crazy thought based on your comment, let's say from, you know, the beginning of time to, you know, earliest 20th century, we're poor culture and that momentum's going. But at least those two sort of symbolically represent like the cure. Now, will we take that cure? I don't know. So I'm just having fun with the sweep of powerdom, basically.
Okay, wonderful. Aiden, you had a comment.
Oh yeah, I was gonna offer something separate, but now that we're on this topic, I'm just thinking what I can add. I mean, I think what's interesting is the puer cultural topic I'm less familiar with. I think David's more familiar with that. You know, what I hear is the split that I think Jung touches on a lot between the rational mind and sort of nature, whereas those used to be closer together. And as that split gets wider and wider, it becomes more and more dangerous, right? We have like technology, we have globalization, we have this capacity as humans to have a huge impact on the world and each other. And as that's growing, it's also like we're getting further and further away from our sort of natural inclinations, connection to nature, connection to each other. Like, so that split, you know, Jung talks about the psyche as the most dangerous thing in modern times. And I think that's true, independent of the puer topic. It's kind of an interesting, it's a different subject matter, but that's the one that I'm more familiar with. And the thing that I wanted to offer is the rose image, David. I wonder if Muriel will might relate to this, because I got this idea from somebody who was in analysis under Yoram Kaufman, whose book we're reading in the archetypal pattern analysis program. And what was shared with me is this idea of the rose as a dominant feature of the rose. It's the flower we give each other, the one flower we give each other that has not yet bloomed. When we give the flower, it's not bloomed yet. So it's sort of like the rose as an image of something that's a promise yet to come. So such a great image, right? With the Little Prince, where it's the rose that's archetypally maybe has this dimension of a promise yet to come, and perhaps that relates to his own adulthood. I don't know. It's just an interesting thought.
Thank you. Thanks, Aiden. Now, Muriel had the good fortune of being in, studying in Zurich, and she interacted with lots of analysts who had a personal contact with von Franz. And so, Muriel, could you tell us a little bit about what that was like?
Sure, but before I go there, I do want to share a story about von Franz that I think is just so emblematic of who the woman was. And I think David's got his finger on the pulse of her genius for sure. But to just riff a little bit on what has been coming up about the puer and the hero. And I think David wove those two together so beautifully. Jung is said to have said in his in his 80s, he said, he used to commission the Jungian puppies into the world and tell them what their work was. And he was really good at it. In the early days, he would have a single meeting with someone and really say, this is what you must do. This is what you must not do. Like Robert Johnson, for example, he said to Robert Johnson, never join a Jungian collective. And Robert Johnson said, I wish I'd have listened, because what ended up happening is he would join these Jungian collectives and be wounded. So what Jung said later in life to the generation that was following him, he said, the age of the hero has reached its zenith. It's becoming a closed replicative system. He said, our generation is charged with the task of the conjunctio, the divine marriage, the sacred marriage, is when the true feminine can emerge from under the thumb of patriarchy and meet a healed masculine, and that's the task. The task is of the sacred marriage. So David, maybe you are intimating that when you say that the relationship between von Franz and Jung was in some respects a divine conjunctio. They were not involved romantically. They had this deep respect for one another, and they got one another. So if we were to say 1933 represented a coming together of two energies that will take us across the threshold out of the quest of the hero into the quest for the beloved, whether that beloved is in the inner world and in the outer world. And I think that's what matures the puer usually is he falls in love. And then the object of his desire has him get a job and has him finish his degree and has him put himself in the world. So I think that's what we're on the cusp of. So I just wanted to just add that as well. David, did you want to comment before I tell a von Franz story?
I'm glad this is recorded because I'm going to review that many times. I think that was fantastic, Muriel.
Okay. So here's a story I have, which it was told, and that's what was so lovely in being in Zurich, is that you had people who supervised with Marie-Louise von Franz, analyzed with Marie-Louise von Franz, were her students, had coffee with her. She was great for just saying, let's finish this over coffee in the cafe. But here's a story that's told that one day she used to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and write for a couple of hours, and then have her breakfast and get ready for the day, go and teach for 3 or 4 hours, and then return in the afternoon after a meal and have her analytical practice, and then revise and do some more writing into the evening. So she was very, very, very much willing to do the work. She was not a puella. But the story goes that one morning she got up and she sat down at her desk to write, and there were no words. The words were gone. Now, in true von Franzian style, she said, "Perhaps I'm having a stroke." Now, I don't know about you, but if I woke up and my words were gone and I had an impulse, perhaps I'm having a stroke, I think I would have called for someone. But she is said to have said, well, if it's a stroke, this is it, because there's no way I could get to help fast enough. So perhaps it's not a stroke. So I think I'll do an active imagination, and I will start to dialogue with this energy that has stolen my words. And so she started, and she said, and this very nasty voice showed up and said, "Why do you even bother? No one reads your books. Why do you bother writing and teaching? Students think you're a joke. Why do you even bother? They just indulge you because you knew Jung. And PhD, dime a dozen. I don't understand why you waste your time." So in true Marie-Louise von Franz style, she talked back to this energy. She said, "Well, I don't think that's absolutely accurate. My books are selling very well, thank you very much. And students go out for coffee with me. They don't just indulge me. And as for a PhD, a dime a dozen for a woman in this age, I don't think so." So what she is said to have said is that this was a negative animus trying to hold her down. And it was because she was on the cusp of not just translating Jung's work, articulating Jung's work, but really bringing her own genius forward. And that's when she was doing the work on number and time and synchronicity. So I think it's just a beautiful story to show how she walked the talk, lived the work, and everything in her was dedicated to bringing forth those ideas. So I share that with you.
Ooh. Can I ask you a question, Muriel? Sort of as a response a little bit.
Sure.
What a fantastic story, and I'm moved by that and have many thoughts about it. And I wanted to ask about her specifically, having met Jung, this sort of, as we're calling this conjunctio moment. When she was 18, she couldn't have been a therapist, right? So I'm wondering, in terms of her professional trajectory, what did that look like in terms of becoming an analyst, in terms of becoming like licensed, or in terms of that trajectory? This is kind of, I realize that this is going energetically a different direction, and I kind of regret that. But I'm really curious about her professional evolution as a Jungian analyst.
Well, she was 18. In fact, there is a recorded dream of Marie-Louise von Franz that she had before she met Jung. And the dream is that she's in Greece and she has a backpack and she's got books in her backpack, but she's got no money and no identity. And she's at the Acropolis. And I think the dream is that all the gods and goddesses come forward with their hands open to give her a gift. And she shared that dream with Jung, and Jung said, "You must study Greek, you must study ancient languages, you must go to the university and finish your degree." So in some respects, it was a meeting of two energies that needed to meet. And I would say the dream prefigured that when the gods give you a gift, you have a responsibility to share that gift with the world. Jung said there was such a thing as the guilt of individuation. And I remember the first time I heard that, I thought, are you kidding me? All the money and the time and the angst I go through, and now I have to carry the guilt that I individuated. He said it's because you withdraw from the collective to find out what your destiny is. And it's the guilt of that drives you back to bring the gold to the collective, to come back and say, look, I found gold and there's more. Not that my gold is your gold, but my journey said I had to come back and share that with you. So I don't know if that's going off topic, but.
No, I'd like to build on that because, well, two thoughts. I don't see von Franz as Jung's disciple necessarily. I think at some point it's her own voice, her own energy. She's not translating what Jung's saying. She's translating what the psyche's saying. I almost see two thrones and, he's sitting there with a crown and she's sitting right next to him. I really see them as equals. And as I mentioned in the talk, I'll read her morning, noon, and night. I mean, she's such an easy, fascinating read that, and Jung, I won't do that. It's harder. So I really see them as peers at some point, not, she's the student. So that's, I just want to react to that. And then when I was doing this talk, I didn't feel guilt so much. I felt duty, sort of like what Joseph Campbell's like. I just felt a sense of duty, like, I've studied this, and whether people agree or disagree or have different interpretation, I was very open to, I'm not trying to change people's mind. I'm just presenting sort of what I think is a treasure, and then people can decide what they want. So it was just more of a sense of duty. What Campbell was saying is, if you discovered you think something's valuable, bring it to other heroes, bring it to the community, and then let them decide, what they want to do with it.
Wonderful, beautiful, David. So I have a question for you, and then there are folks, we have time for questions, so you can go ahead and type exclamation mark. So David, I mean, it's always amazing to see people who come after a master who has, see, what happens is that when really original thinker operates, he breaks new grounds, and he carries a lot of weight with them because he has to kind of push against what was there before. He has to kind of establish something. Now, it is very difficult to be a good student. Okay, the standard of a good student, like I like Leonardo's quotation, is that he's a poor student indeed who doesn't excel his master. Okay, because the master is giving you everything, with open hands. And so you try your best, and you stand. Most people who are students, they don't stand on the shoulders of the master, they drape on the shoulders of the master. So they actually see less than the master. But it looks like von Franz has been a good student in the sense that she stands on the shoulder, she takes in everything, but she has her own voice that gives it an integrity, because these things are very difficult to communicate, and you kind of have to build it within your own soul so that you can speak it. And you have to do it in your own style, not style of others. So you have to kind of take everything and do this kind of alchemy to it with your own soul. And only when you produce something with that, it has the value of moving things forward. And it looks like, from everything that you said, I was not aware. The Poor is sitting on my bookshelf back there, but I have not read it yet, and I'm going to read it. But thank you. I think you showed that that's exactly what von Franz did.
Yeah, what I love what you're saying, because and this is totally in my imagination. This is my fantasy, but I sort of feel like Jung was this incredible wizard who his whole life he was struggling with these concepts, how to communicate. He'd be the first one to say, I've rewritten stuff, I've let it simmer. And von Franz saw this man who almost a little bit in turmoil. Again, my projection of how do I explain this? No one understands me. And it's almost like she had a spiritual duty. Really had nothing to do with Jung. It's sort of like, I have a spiritual duty to help people understand how the psyche, the soul, and the spirit work. And this man who I'm with is doing a heroic job. It took guts. in his world to even do this. And again, my fantasy is she's like, I'm going to commit myself to helping smooth this out, give this organization, be a mouthpiece to the divine in a lot of ways. So I think it might have been a little less about him. She was a good student where she gave him credit and she never said, oh, it's about me. She was very good. But I think it was more about what he's talking about is so important that I'm going to do my best to spread that information. And she's amazing. Without her, I never would have got into any of this, and I never would have understood any of this. That's how important a role she played for me.
Wow, wonderful. Okay, one follow-up. How is her style of writing different from Jung? What is it about her writing that she could reach you in the most powerful way, whereas Jung could not do that in the same way? What's the difference in style?
So I love that question again, because I never really thought of it. When I read Jung, like Symbols of Transformation, it's sort of like when I read Hero with a Thousand Faces. There are so many references to a point, you sort of forget what they were talking about. Like there's so many examples, and it's almost like someone's trying to prove to you, like what I'm talking about has merit. You know, if I give you 20 examples of what this means, it has merit. With von Franz, there is such a confidence. Like, this is what this means, so I don't need to bother to make 10 other analogies to sort of take you way off into left field. This is what it is. So that's what triggered, I would have answered that a while ago saying, it's just a very smooth writing. But now I realize she has such a confidence with these very esoteric, abstract things. How powerful is that? She's like, no, I know this subject and I can tell it to you. I don't need to prove it any other way and bring in any other sources. It's very powerful.
Wonderful. Mariel, you had a comment.
Yeah, I was going to comment on that as well, that my training analyst in Zurich supervised and analyzed with Marie-Louise von Franz, so I would get many stories. And one of the things that he said to me was that she said, if you ever use a Jungian term in an analytical hour, like the shadow, the anima, the animus, go wash your mouth out with soap. Because if you can't explain it in the everyday language of the person in front of you, with their dreams, with their derivatives, with their life experiences, then you haven't integrated it. You don't understand. She would say you should be able to walk from a lecture of Jung, which can be very dense, go to the greengrocer and be able to explain what it was that you've learned. And if you haven't, then you haven't done the work. You haven't integrated and incorporated it. And I think, David, that's what comes so strong in her writing, that her peasant stock is still ever present. And, you know, so often she would show up for a lecture and she still got the dirt under her fingernails because she was in the garden till the last moment. So she had her own tower at Bollingen. It wasn't as big as Jung's, but it was her own tower. And she very much connected with nature. And I think that comes out in her writing.
Beautiful.
Can I
Aiden.
dovetail on that quickly?
Yep.
I love that you shared that, Muriel, and on the fairy tale conversation, the green grocer idea. I don't know if it was with me or with the group, but I just love that so much. And I want to dovetail on that for this group, for the people that are still here from the discussion of this meeting, because Muriel, something that you said about von Franz with the negative Animus experience where she went to write and there were no words, there's a powerful sentiment there that I really want to catch for this group in a green grocer way, I hope, which is this idea that we can dialogue with very deep parts of ourselves. You know, David was talking earlier about having different conscious centers and, you know, using different ways of talking about this, different centers of consciousness. But the point is, she questioned her own thinking And I think we sort of adopt, when we think about mindfulness or cognitive behavioral, or let's just say like there's many practices that we sort of take from the East to let go of our own thoughts, right? But what Jung did that I think is profound is in the West, create a way in which we can dialogue with ourselves. If we have a thought, like von Franz, I wrote down the notes somewhere in my but she had this thought, why are you even writing? Nobody reads your books. PhD, dime a dozen. People are just, they're just being friendly in your teaching because you knew Jung. But what she was able to do, and this is a profound Jungian idea, is question those thoughts. She didn't just say, I had a thought, so it's true. Or even more so, she didn't say, I had a thought, so it's my thought. She didn't do that. The thought arose and she dialogued with it, and she said, and she took it seriously. She took it seriously. And she dialogued with it, sort of to say, nobody reads your books anyways. And she took it seriously. Is that true? No, it's not true. People are buying my books. People only hang out with you because you studied with Jung in your teaching position. No, that's not true. People take me to coffee and we hang out and have fun. PhD is a dime a dozen. Well, actually, in this modern context, as a woman, it's very meaningful. So she didn't just identify with her thoughts. She questioned them and dialogued with them, and then went on to do some of her greatest work, as Muriel says. So there's something profound about that. When we have a vision, when we have a dream, even when we have a thought or a mood, the Jungian thing is to stop and dialogue with it. Hey, I see you, mood. I see you, thought. I see you, fantasy. Let's talk. And that's a life-changing practice in my mind.
I'd love to just build very quickly on that, and to Nicholas' question and Tanya's question that she asked in our group. I dialogue with my Animus and Anima energy. I mentioned in the talk, these are autonomous, almost divine beings, that have their own agendas. They're sort of fascinating. And so I take it very seriously. I mean, I'm just like, what does my Animus have to say? And what is my Animus? It's taken years of study. What are the characteristics of Animus energy? And my Anima is very different. And what is that agenda? And I really feel, going to Shikran's question, to break us out of our puer, and to what Mira was saying about, it's not the hero's journey. I see the hero as almost being a servant of the Anima and Animus energy, trying to understand what they want. And that's a whole separate topic in years of study, but it's a little hint of where I think that is where the hero's journey go. You have these two divine elements, Anima and Animus, who are giving us a lot of information and demand attention. And so I take that extremely seriously, of trying to understand what those divine elements are trying to communicate to me.
Thank you, David. Next up is going to be Mike, Madeline, Marianne, and Betty. Mike, 1 minute. Please keep it on topic.
On topic, 17 seconds. Question for David and Muriel. Jung and von Franz had deep thoughts about Gnosticism, mysticism, and even alchemy. She also did most of the correspondence with this guy named Wolfgang Pauli, who was one of his Jung's patients. And Wolfgang Pauli invented quantum entanglement and the weirdness of all that stuff. When Wolfgang died, Wolfgang's wife burned all those letters. Do you have any information about those concepts? Also, she was an invalid with Parkinson's for the last 15 years of her life, possibly in a wheelchair. Any stories about that? And I yield the balance of my time.
I can pipe in to say that she tells the story about how Wolfgang Pauli would come to see her, and he was very conflicted in terms of his sexual proclivities. He was getting into all kinds of trouble and drinking, but they would have these profound discussions. But she said, but he wouldn't pay me. So it was like he came for analysis and just would not deem her suitable to pay for the analysis. Yet she continued to see him because she found his ideas fascinating. So I think it really was a collaboration that inspired her to explore number, time, and synchronicity, which is right in where her genius was shining. And she went to Jung and asked his permission, said, you know, this comes out of this collaboration. He was your patient and now he's mine, although I guess he's not her patient if he's not willing to pay for it. But anyway, and he said, look, I'm an old man. This is yours. You take it. And it was a blessing, but not that she needed it anyway, because I think it was there. And certainly her disability, I mean, and the story is that she would not take any pain meds because she did not want to muddy her thinking. She did not want to be semi-conscious, and she suffered incredibly so, but she endured. There's a wonderful book called The Fountain, what is it called? The Fountain of Love and Wisdom. And it was published after her death. And it's a collection of reflections from her analysans, from her colleagues, from her friends, from people in the Jungian world. And it's a lovely way to feel like you get to know this woman.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Muriel. Next up is going to be Madeline, Marianne, Betty, and Andrew. Madeline.
Yes, thank you so much, David, and also Muriel. Shrikant, I loved what you said about draped on the shoulders of giants. I was thinking about what David said, our puer culture and the big society of the spectacle. We had talked briefly in my breakout room about the puer, or even the eternal feminine being lionized, that the downside of that is being the eternal victim. And one of the things that I do when I read the news, I try to read from a spectrum of conservative, centrist, and liberal, is I try to imagine myself as if it were a dream. I try to imagine myself in the place of the different major actors. So even though in my politics and other thinking, I didn't agree with the Capitol rioters, I could understand that feeling of sometimes just wanting to storm into this complicated place and tear it all down and set it on fire, just purify the whole thing. And so when I see different things playing out in the news, I can kind of see different archetypes at work besides the puer.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to comment on, yeah, I don't agree with what happened at the Capitol, but it was horrible. But it was like an unlocking of this animal energy. Literally, a man was dressed as an animal. So from a Jungian perspective, you're like, this is a crazy animal energy that's being unleashed, basically. There it is in front of us. And then I just want to go back to something I've said a few times. Because von Franz helped teach me to look at every story and character, especially like in political news, like you're mentioning, Madeline, I now look behind it all. Those are just characters in a drama where they're just representing it. And so what von Franz did in The Little Prince, that was like, this is a character, but how this character is expressing itself is really telling you a lot about what's behind it. And so the news is really sort of superficial, especially now. It's just really just pure propaganda to raise our temperature or get us to buy something. So I think more of, and you trigger this while you were talking that, why are we being presented these images? What do these characters represent in sort of a Jungian von Franzian lens? So after Puer Arturnus and what she did with The Little Prince, I've never looked at the world the same way. I just look at every character. It could be a movie poster. It could be someone at a party. I'm always saying what you see is not exactly what you get. What is happening psychologically behind the scenes? Because there's a lot there. And then just to wrap it up, that Capitol incident was an eruption where these characters appear, you know, and one's flying a Confederate flag in the middle of the Capitol. You know, that didn't even happen in the Civil War. So it's all over the map. It's horrifying and fascinating at the same time.
Thank you. Next up is Marianne, followed by Betty. Marianne? Marianne, you need to unmute yourself. Okay, next up, go ahead.
Oh, this is for my question? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Has anyone here read and reviewed the new compilation by von Franz that just came out? Ah,
Okay.
I should have known.
All right. Okay.
You speak.
I will just say I'm only on chapter 12, so I'm taking my time. My first impressions are that it is fabulous. It's at least volume 1. You can sense how young she is. And so many of the tales that she's analyzing in the beginning are tales I don't know. They're not all Grimms. A lot of Inuit tales and Innu tales and from different cultures. So it comes out in soft cover, I think, in March. The hardcover is about $77. So, you know, it's a little steep. It's not as bad as the Red Book, but it's a little steep. But I think it's really going to be, and I think there's going to be 8 volumes, 6 or 8 volumes, and this is the first. So I recommend it.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Betty, Andrew, and John. Betty.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, everyone. I think that it's a really good point that David made about the journey being within, considering we live in a consumerist culture that pushes us to search for fulfillment outside of ourselves. And I think the point about taking the red pill and facing reality is really key to maturity. And in our group, George made the point that a mark of maturity is discernment. And I think that really ties into when the phrase that it doesn't matter what job we do, we should just do it thoroughly and conscientiously. Thank you.
Betty, if I ever write a book, I'm going to hire you to narrate it. Your voice sounds incredible. It's like,
thank you.
It just lands when you, anyways. And the content of what you said.
And Betty is always amazing in the kind of the conciseness and pithiness of everything that she says. So really appreciate that, Betty. Next up is going to be Andrew, followed by John. Andrew.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for presenting this material. You know, one thing that came up, and I would like to get your take on this, as you were talking about her experience in doubting herself and wondering, you know, am I really this good? And that thing that we all go through, I think, that self-doubt and that inner chatter. What do you think about this possibility? It just occurred to me that that's actually perhaps just a biological reaction from evolutionary adaptation. Would be when you sense that you have a potential to supersede your leader, there's maybe a fear of retribution by the community that you're now overtaking the leader. And that's maybe, you know, that kind of, that cultural DNA that's in us, maybe that's the biological explanation for why we have those feelings. It's basically comes out of fear.
Well, so it's a really interesting, when I think of Animus energy, and I go to, there's a lot of self-help, there's a lot of groups saying, hey, don't doubt yourself, you know, question those voices, you're better, you know, and people call it self-doubt. And sort of to your point, Andrew, I think in evolution, our animus has a lot of lessons learned. And it really needs to be listened to. Like, if you put your hand on the stove, it's going to be burned. You know, hey, I really want to put my hand on the stove. And so the solution is don't talk back to the animus and ignore it, but listen to it. And it's very hard because sometimes it's a voice that just needs to be obeyed. It's like, I've created you evolutionarily. You don't know how to run your own body, and I know what's sort of good for you. And so a lot of times in that dialogue, it could be, yeah, I don't agree with you. But then a lot of it could be, to your point, maybe you know more than I do. Maybe you are leading my psyche. And there's a certain humility. You know, our culture is all about, you know, you're right, you know, it's all about you. I'm really learning to obey and listen to what my dreams and visions are saying. And a lot of times it's like, you just need to change. It's going to sound painful, but you need to change your attitude. So I think there's a balance. There's a time, like what von Franz said, going, no, I don't agree with you that, you know, I'm worthless. But then there's other times to say, maybe you have a point. I'm not perfect and I need to change. I don't think it's one or the other.
Thank you. Next up is going to be John, followed by Barry. John.
Yeah, just a kind of a quick offhand impression. I've been interested in these kind of ideas for quite some time, and I've got a kind of quite a collection of things I've gathered over the years. I've just relocated from Los Angeles to Portland, Oregon, and spent some of the year going through boxes of 800 books and piles of articles and magazines. And the one I was trying to find on the internet right now that I thought would be really fun to share in the chat, I think this was about the time, maybe this was from about the time when Marie-Louise von Franz died. There was an article in the Rolling Stone magazine, of all things, by somebody named Jonathan Cott. A brilliant, brilliant article that was an appreciation at a cultural level. And if people are not aware of it, and maybe David is aware of it, or maybe Muriel is aware of it, but I have hard copies of some of these things that are very hard to find now. Probably that issue would be in a public library in microfilm, but I think that with the interest in this group, I think that people may have some materials that are unusual that might be interesting to share. Thank you.
John, could you go ahead and send me a PDF of that, just to scan of it?
Well, unfortunately, that's in storage in Los Angeles.
Okay.
And I would love to get my hands on it and scan it. Now that I've realized that you can't find it on the internet.
Okay.
But that's a thought, is to people who have these kind of materials that they found to be exceptionally insightful and interesting in this regard. What's interesting about the Rolling Stone magazine is it really puts it in saying Marie-Louise von Franz had something important to say for public culture, and apart from just being something very esoteric and very specialized. But the Rolling Stone magazine, the article is by Jonathan Cott. I think he wrote a couple of them, but the one I believe one was called Forever Jung. And maybe people will, well, again, I think that when libraries open, you can probably find them in libraries.
Thank you, John. Next up is going to be Barry. Barry, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed everything and I really learned a lot. I just ordered from my library Number and Time, and I look forward to reading it as an engineer. As an artist that I became, and a poet from when my wife was on dialysis, I used to go to the Tualatin River to deal with the stress and the emotions that I picked up. And then I painted the Tualatin River in the, if you look behind me, in the wine glass is the Tualatin River, which is near where she went to dialysis. And my wife's last painting was a rose, and I had to put on her grave marker. My wife, I have a personality on a Myers-Briggs ENTJ, and she was an ISFP. She was literally my shadow. And I depended on her to calm me. And when she was on dialysis, I lost that calmness. So I had to learn to do it myself. So I took up yoga. And in yoga, when I went to I did yoga in a vineyard, and the vineyard person that led us on a tour said that these are Pinot grapes and they're very thin-skinned and sensitive. And I said, that's me. So I wrote this really short poem that encapsulates the shadow and the rose and the pinots. I call it "The Vine Dresser Prunes My Rose," by being my wife. My Pinot grapes are exposed. My rose's red blood flows, cleansed by the tears from my Pinots.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Barry. Appreciate that. Thank you. Next up is going to be Nicholas.
Yeah, I'm just curious for David, at that point in your life that you described when you were 29 and you found the Puer Aeternus and Marie-Louise von Franz, I'm just curious if you feel comfortable saying something about how your life transformed, maybe in terms of career or values or anything like that.
It's a huge question. I think how my life transformed is, it was like taking that red pill in the Matrix. Like I've never looked back in terms of studying von Franz and Jung and depth psychology. It was like that dark forest I was in was the materialistic, superficial world, and that collapsed. And I really had no choice. Like that, there was nowhere to go in that forest. I had to go in the inner world. And so it was a miracle I found that book in Cousin Jeff's home at that time. You know, it's like this, maybe it was always there, you know, it's the classic hero's journey. You know, all the clues are there, but when are you open to look at it? But the transformation is, look at the talk I'm doing now, 29 years later. That's how passionate and how important the subject is. And what I want to thank you all about is just by asking me to do this talk, like Shrikant was saying, I went back in time and looked at this in a completely different lens. And to your point, Nicholas, it was one of the most profound episodes in my life to start down this path. And I'm happy to promote von Franz because she gave me a gift, a tremendous gift.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, what I was saying to David is that, you know, these deep thinkers, what happens is that when you revisit them, especially after a break, it's a very unique experience because I'm talking about thinkers who make real big difference in your life. You take in everything, and then it's not passive. You know, you work with it. You work with those ideas, and you keep working. You keep working, and then when you come back to them, it's a very odd experience. It's kind of meeting, on one hand, this kind of meeting an old friend. You know, there is a tremendous amount of tenderness and sheer joy of looking at them again. Okay. But at the same time, you can also see how much you have grown. So it acts as a mirror for you of saying, okay, where is it that I've grown? And you actually discover some things. Typically, these people are so deep that the first time you encounter them or your first bout with them, you understand some things. And because you have internalized those things, you're able to see something at a completely new level. And it's an incredible experience of being able to do that. You know, there are very, very few people in my life few thinkers for whom I feel like that. And it is wonderful to see, you know, David, that, you know, von Franz is a person like that for you. And it's always a, you know, it's always a pleasure doing that. The second thing that you were saying is that I'm really thankful that you're sharing this with us, because what it does is that it's partly kind of, you know, your debt. And the way I see it, I'm doing this. Louis Sullivan is one of my favorite thinkers. He's an architect who came up with the term form follows function. He's a very deep thinker on how do you design things? How do you live? And so I'm planning to do a whole 12-part series on him. So part of it is like a debt to him. in the sense that I think that everybody should know about him. It's like, it's like, that's one part of it. The second part of it is that it's like, act of benevolence towards the world. They say, look at him. You need to learn something from him. See what he has to offer. So it's you're offering something that you have learned. And many of these people are hard to get at the heart of, because their thought is very deep and very expansive. And most people kind of go at the edges of it and never really go deep to the core to discover them. So David, thank you so much for bringing von Franz to us. Really grateful. All right, go ahead, David, any final thoughts? And Aiden, any final thoughts?
No, this is far exceeded my expectations. So thank you.
Thank you, David.
And I would echo the same thing. David, thanks for putting this together for us. And thanks to everyone for showing up. We'll be posting shortly the next Practical Jung. We're working on the details of that, which will be March 14th. So please stay posted on that. Is this a good time to announce sort of the change, Shrikant, and sort of the scheduling, or should we leave that?
What we're going to do is that, no, we'll go ahead. I'll go ahead and announce it. It's going to be March 14th. The next one is going to be, from then on, we're going to do it every last Sunday at 5 o'clock, which gives more time. Aiden has been wanting to do an experimental meetup on MBTI. And I keep telling him, don't do it in the middle because you want to have enough time so we'll be doing that. But thank you very much, Aiden. And thank you, David. Really wonderful.